welcome to the World Lens podcast, where once a week we take a look at what's happening around the world from a global business lens. I am your host, Michelle Evans, digital specialist at the World Trade Center Institute. This week I'm joined with Bruce McIndoe, president of McIndoe Risk Advisory and a WTCI board member. Hey, Bruce.
Hey, how you doing, Michelle?
I'm well. How are you doing?
I'm doing great.
So this week I wanted to talk to you about an article I came across, and it just kind of blew my mind because it's something I'd never thought about. So no expert in any of this, but there
Neither
was
am
an
I,
article
but we
about
can
the
talk
British.
about it.
There's an article about British museums loaning the stolen crown jewels that they looted 150 years ago from Ghana, loaning it back to them. Why do you think they're doing that now? Like, why 150 years later?
Yeah, when this topic came up, I was like, "Oh, that's interesting." But this has been going on for as long as I've been alive and before, right? And through human history, where there's raiders and war, and there's they're stealing things because they're going in
Right.
people's homes, or they are protecting them, right? So these have all been
Mm-hmm.
accumulated over many years. And so I did look at the UK one because I'm like, okay, what's going on here? And essentially, you know these back colonial times, and the Brits basically took them, right? And these are gold,
Mm-hmm.
precious objects. So that was like, okay, should they be returned? But then the UK has a law that doesn't allow them to return them, right?
Which is
Well,
crazy.
but again, when you're a colonial power over hundreds of years, right? And you've accumulated all of this from all of your traipsing around the globe.
They want to
They
make sure
want
you
to
can
run
keep it.
on all of their museums and everything, right? So that's largely trying to protect that. So I think this is an opportunity for the loan, and it's I think it's 3 years or whatever, but renewable.
Mm-hmm.
And it's an opportunity where they can basically provide this back so the country has it, and can kind of kick the can down the road. And I think it's a good gesture on the part of whatever precipitated this. I mean, you know, I believe, and I don't recall, but if these were actually stolen, right? So maybe it wasn't just the Brits, but maybe someone stole it, and then the museum acquired them,
Acquired it.
and it's like, yeah, okay, these are stolen goods. They should make their way back to the rightful owner, right? If that's the case.
Yeah. So if I'm Ghana, I'm just not going to give them back. What happens then?
Um, they just renew the loan, no problem.
It's still crazy to me that, like, it's like me breaking into your house, stealing all of your things, and saying, you know what? It's been a couple years. I'll let you hold them for a couple years if you want.
Mm-hmm.
But this isn't the first time that this has happened. There was an incident in November where the Parthenon
Oh
marbles
yeah,
that were stolen
Greeks.
or taken, they were supposed to be given back, but the UK and the Greek prime ministers had a meeting and they canceled it over this.
Mhm.
Do you think it's like going to be some type of future political bargaining chip that these countries will
Yeah,
use?
I don't know, maybe bargaining, but it's going to be a bone of contention. Let's put it that way. Every nation has its history, right? And and
Mm-hmm.
whether it's Egypt, whether it's Greece, whatever, and so yeah, I think there is a broad desire by the citizens to reaccumulate their historical artifacts and their history and religion. And so I think that anytime there's an opportunity between on a political stage, not war, to negotiate and discuss, hey, you have some really important things that are very meaningful to our society, we'd like them back. Sure, let's have that conversation, right? And it may be, and again, I'm not an expert in this, but maybe Greece versus whomever, that this has been a very serious issue, and neither side is giving an inch, and it's has caused tension, right? And they're basically saying, until you negotiate on this, we're not going to talk about anything else, and just cross their arms, right? So that's politics. That's, negotiation, and at some point, something will be more important. So,
Yeah, I get that. I mean, but do you think at any point in these global business negotiations, ethics or morality come into play?
100%, yeah. I think a lot of times, what's driving these may be more on that than the ledger's side, right? As far as, the value of what's going on, right? So, I was involved here in the U.S. with NASA, and commercial companies are sending human remains to the moon.
Mm,
Well, in the Navajo American Indians and other native language cultures, the moon is a sacred space, a sacred place,
right.
right? And so they're like, no, you can't just go and throw human remains. This is like an incredibly important part of our religion and our culture, right? And
Hmm.
so, what do you do about that? How do you deal with that? And obviously they're going to be trying to work through this now. The sad thing about this whole situation as it propped up is that the U.S. government and NASA had already agreed to notify ahead of time the tribes, what their intention was to put things, like human remains on the moon, and they didn't do that. So that made this even, more difficult situation. Had they negotiated something before sending it, then we'd be in a different place, right?
I guess they figured it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission in that
Yeah,
situation.
or bureaucracy, and nobody paid attention to the terms that they had agreed to, right? So yeah.
Right. So, like you mentioned earlier, this has been happening
Hmm.
for as long as we can remember, where these like looted things in the midst of colonialism are just kind of scattered all over the world. But recently, Emory University in Atlanta,
Hmm.
they just returned artifacts to Greece, and then the Met did that same thing with like 14 of them in Cambodia.
Hmm.
I have two questions actually. First off, how are they obtaining these artifacts in the first place? And what happens if everyone grows a conscience and decides like all these museums are going to give everything back to their places of origin?
So both of these actually now start having more of a nexus with what I do, right? Security and risk management. So
Yeah.
number one, a lot of these artifacts were not obtained through war, or these were stolen and trafficked to people that were willing to buy it, whether it was ivory tusks, or whether it was golden jewelry, or whether it was, carvings and those kinds of things. So the you know ports of entry and are very sensitized to monitoring and trying to slow down, not going to stop this kind of trade. So if that this is ill-gotten goods and it gets into a market, and then down the road, the university acquires it from maybe an estate of a alum, and then find
Hmm.
out that this was stolen from Cambodia, then, and they are doing the right thing to return that, to the rightful owner, right? And so,
Hmm.
so that's what those kinds of things. But as far as like the trafficking part of it, it's just like drugs. It's just like everything else. There's leaky holes, and shipping things where they're not shipping it through normal channels. They're not sending it through UPS or DHL. They're
Right.
smuggling it in on a yacht, right? And so, yeah, so that's a challenge. The auction houses are also set up. I've worked with them, uh, always trying to look at pedigree and provenance of where did these things come from. Is there ownership record? So if an estate goes on sale and they've got artwork and artifacts, can they prove that they were properly acquired, right, before they're put on auction? And if they can't, they won't put it on auction, or if they do, they'll warn the buyer that the ownership of this is not known, right? And
And then what happens in that
so
case?
normally they'll know, like, okay, this is a Greek antiquity. they'll work with the Greek government and let them know, we have these items. Is there any claim to these? So they kind of like will work that and potentially return them, but rather than trying to put them up for auction and have them illegally sold, right? So
And there are people who are still interested in illegally selling these things.
so then there's a black market, right, for everything. And same thing, in this realm, especially when it is very, when it's jewels and precious stones and gold and things like that. It is a illicitly traded item, and again, the person that's buying it is buying stolen property, and so all those laws kick in. But yeah, tamping it down, uh, I don't see it. What I do see from a technology perspective, let's look at it the other way. So, for example, the British Museum, is going to give back a particular artifact. With technology today, they can do a very detailed 3D imaging of that object, right? So they could present that object virtually, right? They don't need a physical, urn sitting there. I could see, a 3D view of this thing and look at it and see how beautiful it is, but I don't necessarily have to own it, right? Um,
What about like replicas
so,
instead of
so
like
the
a
other would be,
3D
so, and
image?
now, now you're getting into, so for example, we could 3D print with great precision an artifact. But now, now you're in treading on, okay, now you're creating a replica. Well, what's the ownership of that art and that design, right? And so now you're really starting to step into copyright and other issues as far as that. But I think, uh, museums have been doing catalog books for as long as I've been alive, right? It would seem to me like they could have permission to present a 3D picture versus
Hmm.
2D, and still give people, knowledge about this particular area of art history, and talk about it without actually replicating the object.
Yeah, that makes
Or they could
sense.
license it, they could license and say, okay, owner, we'll license and make a 3D version of this.
Yeah.
And
I mean, if I'm Ghana, that's what I'd do. Yeah, you can 3D license this, but I'm going to keep the original. You're not getting it back.
yeah.
So like do you think that some of these items are better kept in the museums that they are than the place where they were stolen from? Do you have any
I
like
mean, we keep saying,
thoughts around
yeah, we
that?
keep saying stolen. So, I also have to, the other side of this is, had whomever took them from the country, if the country was in, warfare, and buildings were being bombed and museums were being bombed, and that these would have been lost. So it's not that they
Mhm.
were stolen, it's actually they were taken and protected, and rather than seeing them, get burnt up or blown up, right? So,
Mhm.
we have to look at it from a couple of different perspectives. That it's, was never like, okay, I'm going to steal this and take it back for my personal wealth or my nation's wealth. We're going to take these and we're going to protect them, right? And then getting them back. Well, who is the rightful owner if the owners were killed or passed away, right? And so, and again, a lot of that work goes on and continues to go on, especially around World War II and everything that happened
Yeah.
there. So yeah, so I think that we can't always just view this as an illegal act, right? These are just,
Mhm.
things migrate for lots of reasons, and we have to be prepared and work through the process to say, hey, okay, I have this. For example, I could be in South America and just be going through the woods and maybe find, a little cave, and I go in there and curious, and then find that, there's a, an urn or a gold, necklace or something that I just happened to find that's been there for 300 years, right?
Mhm.
Okay, well, I could say, oh, finders keepers, losers weepers, right? No. Right.
I mean, you find it on their soil, I feel like they have claim to
Well,
it.
clearly, but a tourist could say, oh, I'm just going to put this in my suitcase and take it home, right?
True.
and then they keep it for 30 years, and then suddenly, they pass away, and their children are looking at this and say, well, I don't know, let's see what it's worth, right? And then that's when it enters back into the market, and someone's going to be evaluating and saying, wow, this looks like Inca and da 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 da.
Mm-hmm.
And then, any idea where they got it? Nope. They never really said anything about it, right? And then they could say, well, then what, right? And so at that point, I don't, again, not being an expert, I don't know what happens at that point where someone's identified, this is an Inca treasure, it's worth $20,000, and you have no, documented claim to it. Then it becomes, I'm sure, a whole legal process at that point that I'm not familiar with. But it's the point that I'm trying to make is at some point it enters the marketplace, and the people that
Mm-hmm.
are supporting that marketplace, the auctioneers, the appraisers, have a responsibility for understanding where, is this a rightfully owned item, and then
Mm-hmm.
things go from there as far as trying to sort it out.
So, do you think that now, because people are more conscious and aware of things that have happened in the past, and they're trying to make,
Amends.
they're trying to make things right,
Hmm.
and do you foresee a bunch of empty museums or a bunch of museums with licenses to replicate these like foreign objects?
I would say probably eventually all of that, right? It's going to be the museums basically saying, well, we can't prove ownership, but you can't either, right? And so, the possession is it, right? We have it.
Yeah.
When there is a rightful ownership issue, it'll be dealt with either through the courts or through negotiation, right? Relative
Mm.
to those things. So, and then, when you go into museums, there's always a small percentage of things that are just like the things, and then
Mm-hmm.
95% of things that are just things, right? And so I don't see the things disappearing. It's going to be all the high profile, high value items that get all the attention. And so I don't see a just this mass exodus where museums start trying to find the original homes of them. Uh,
I don't think so either, but one can hope. I do have one thing that I kind of want to circle
mhm.
back to in terms of the law that the UK has in
Yeah.
place. They put these, like, I guess you can call them safeguards in place because they knew at some point this would become a thing. Do you think that they would eventually kind of, like get rid of this law?
My guess is the law is there because this has been a thing for a long time, right? So this is settled at this point. It's like, no, we're not going to do that. Done, right? And then people can go
Hmm.
bang on that door all they want. Um, yeah, I would assume the Brits, especially the British Empire, are going to
Hmm.
keep this in force, but again, on a case by case basis, we'll figure out, what is the best, solution. And in this
Yeah.
case, loaning it for 3 years, and having the opportunity to renew that for indefinitely, then maybe that's the answer clearly that they came up with. I'm sure that if this becomes everybody now is knocking on the door saying we want our stuff loaned back, right? Then
Right.
deal with that onslaught, and it won't just be carte blanche. It'll be case by case, and and
Right.
then back to your whole negotiation. It could be, okay, well, we'll loan this to you if, right,
Hmm.
and then there's some quid pro quo between the parties to essentially get them back in physically, even if they don't have clear ownership of it. So yeah, so I think
Yeah.
it's this is going to continue, and interesting uh, that I've when the topic came up this last week, and I was thinking about it's not something that's like in our consciousness all the time, right? But if you
Right.
go into like Google News or Apple News and say returned artifacts, and then you see 10, 15, 20 articles in the last year. It's like, okay, well, this is a big thing, right?
Right. I mean, it definitely has me going down a rabbit hole of, what people are doing with these things, but, gives you something to think about, right?
Yep, and it's one, it's drugs, medicine, animal parts, that other
Mhm.
cultures revere, whether it's spleens and ivory tusks and all different things they use for traditional medicine, and all of these kinds of trades and theft
Mhm.
and illicit trafficking is all going on under the surface, and this is just one. Yeah,
Yeah.
unfortunately, human trafficking too, right? So it's
Ugh.
so hard.
That is another topic for
That's
another
another
day.
day.
Thank you so much,
Yep,
Bruce, for
fun
joining us.
conversation. Thanks, Michelle.
Same. Can you tell people how to find you online if they want to, continue the conversation with you?
Sure. Well, yeah, I'm just LinkedIn or my website, Macinda Risk Advisory, and my job is to help companies navigate challenges around global risk and their people and their operations. So it's interesting topic, but it has a nexus with companies as well because they are a lot of acquirers of this kind of, for their own offices and things, and they kind of need to scratch their head and say, where'd these come from, right? Do we properly own them? And if we don't, maybe we need to return them.
Yep, and they can reach out to
Yeah.
you just for that. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Please visit World Trade Center Institute online at WTCI.org for more insights, events, opportunities, and also follow us on social at WTC Institute on all channels. Thanks,
Thank
Bruce.
you.
See you next week.